The damp earth yielded with a soft, wet sound each time the shovel bit into it. The man worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, his muscles aching in a familiar way. This was honest labor, a simple physical truth. A sudden, sharp clang broke the pattern. The vibration rang up the wooden handle and into his bones. He dropped to his knees immediately, ignoring the cold seeping through his trousers. His fingers scraped away the dark, clinging soil. They found a flat, unyielding surface. It was a metal box, its iron skin thick with rust. It felt deliberately heavy, something sunk deep to stay hidden. The lid was sealed with old, cracked solder. He worked the blade of his shovel into the narrow seam, leaning his full weight until the metal gave a piercing shriek. Inside, nestled against the corrosion, lay a ledger bound in dark leather. The cover was unnaturally smooth and supple. He lifted it out, surprised by its solid weight. The pages were crisp, the ink a deep, unfaded black. His thumb brushed against the meticulous script. It was orderly and precise. He read a few lines of dry, administrative language. Dates, quantities, sums of money. Then his eyes caught on a simple phrase denoting origin. The clinical words described a method of acquisition that turned his stomach to ice. It was something no merchant's ledger should ever contain. The distant shouts of his crew and the rumble of a cart faded into muffled silence. The sun on his back felt suddenly distant and weak. A deep chill had taken root in his core. He carried the strongbox to a felled pine at the wood's edge. The rough bark dug into his legs as he sat. He opened the ledger again, his hands feeling less sure than usual. He began to read in a low murmur, giving voice to the silent words. The entries were stark and horrifying. Each line itemized a date, a terse description, a method, and a final price. The methods were listed with brutal simplicity. Each was a euphemism for a theft of personhood. The prices varied, higher for those deemed robust, lower for the frail. The horror did not arrive as a scream, but as a slow, creeping dread. It thickened with every page he turned. The same disciplined hand had maintained this grisly accounting for years, then decades. This was not a record of chance misfortune. It was the balance sheet of a vast, cold-blooded enterprise. The very dryness of the tone made the suffering it catalogued all the more profound. He closed the book with a soft thud. The sound echoed in the quiet clearing. He looked out at the land he was meant to tame and make new. The gentle slope and mature trees now felt like a lie. This ground was not innocent. It was a grave for secrets. A rot had festered here for generations, merely covered by new growth. The peaceful field seemed to hum with a silent, terrible energy. He understood now. The wilderness had grown over a wound that never healed. The story of this place had been waiting, patient and suffocating, for someone to listen. The discovery felt too immense for one man. The narrative seemed to pull back from the lone figure on the log. It retreated through the long years, through seasons of growth and decay. The quiet field dissolved. In its place was the vibrant blaze of an autumn long past. The air was crisp with wood smoke and turning leaves. The same river valley lay raw and new below a high ridge. 3 riders were silhouetted against the lowering sun, their horses stamped impatiently on the rocky path. They looked down upon a small cluster of log cabins in the clearing. The sound of axes and raised voices drifted up to them. These were the Croft brothers, arriving with the hopeful air of pioneers seeking a fresh start. From this distance, they were just figures in a landscape. Their true purpose was hidden behind ordinary ambition. But the reader now carried a dark knowledge from the future. That shadow fell across this scene of promise. The land was not yet hollow, but its fate was already written in the crisp pages of a ledger not yet bound. The stage was set for the coming darkness. Late autumn settled its grim weight upon the river valley. The small cluster of log cabins seemed to huddle against the wilderness, a fragile outpost in a vast sea of trees. Mist clung to the ground, and the air held the twin scents of wood smoke and damp earth. Each day was a testament to survival in this raw, untamed place. The arrival of the three men broke the settlement's weary rhythm. They entered the clearing with a purpose that felt both foreign and deliberate. Their clothes were worn from travel, but their bearing was unmistakably upright. The settlers paused in their tasks, watching with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. An elder emerged from the largest cabin, his face a map of hard years. He studied the newcomers with a searching gaze. The tallest of the brothers stepped forward. His voice was calm and carried easily across the space. He introduced himself as Silas and his brothers as Matthias and Caleb. He spoke of their professions with a quiet confidence, offering skills this isolated place desperately needed. A visible wave of relief passed through the small crowd. The elder's stern expression softened into something like gratitude. He welcomed them with words of genuine appreciation. The brothers' grave courtesy was accepted as humility. Their sharp intelligence was mistaken for sincerity. The community, desperate for such pillars, embraced them without question. The forest around them seemed to watch, holding its breath. Later, inside Magistrate Josiah Ward's cabin, the scent of herbs mingled with wood smoke. Silas Croft sat opposite the magistrate and the innkeeper, Samuel Brewer. He thanked them for the welcome. His posture suggested a man of quiet authority. He proposed a formal arrangement. His family would provide essential services in exchange for a plot of land. Silas had already identified the perfect location. He described a secluded parcel on a wooded rise overlooking the river. He called it a hallowed space, a peaceful acre for a chapel and a consecrated burial ground. Magistrate Ward agreed readily, seeing only a pious offer to fill a genuine need. Samuel Brewer nodded his genial approval, noting that a proper graveyard was a mark of civilization. The agreement was sealed with a handshake. While Silas negotiated, his brothers were already at work. In the central clearing, Matthias had quietly assembled a temporary workbench. With quiet competence, he repaired a broken wagon wheel. His skilled hands moved with surety, earning silent nods of approval from the settlers who watched. He spoke little, letting his work speak for him. Near the inn, Caleb Croft held a different kind of court. His youthful charm and easy smile drew people in. He spoke of faith and fellowship with a warmth that felt immediately genuine. He assured one settler that their arrival felt like providence. The community, hungry for spiritual comfort, listened eagerly. They embraced him without reservation. By day's end, the bargain was firmly struck. The Croft brothers had secured their foothold. They were no longer strangers but welcomed partners. The trust they had cultivated felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. For now, that ground was not yet hollow. In the days that followed, the brothers settled into their roles with practiced diligence. Silas oversaw the clearing of the cemetery land. He directed the cutting of trees and the leveling of the earth with the solemn air of a man consecrating holy ground. The community saw a leader investing himself in their future. In his workshop, Matthias began his real work. The scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust filled the air. His hands, skilled and sure, shaped wood into coffins and simple funeral furnishings. Yet, in private moments, A tremor would sometimes betray him. He would pause, staring at the simple boxes as if they already held a terrible weight. Caleb's moment arrived on a bright Sabbath morning. He stood before the entire settlement in the makeshift meeting hall. His voice was a powerful instrument, rising and falling with practiced emotion. He spoke of community, resilience, and the solace of shared faith. It was a performance of such conviction that it solidified his place. Men nodded in grim agreement. Women wiped tears from their eyes, feeling a newfound strength. That evening, behind the closed door of their quarters, the atmosphere shifted. The three brothers gathered by the firelight. Silas reinforced the plan with calm precision, outlining the next steps. Caleb, still flushed with his success, seemed to revel in the ease of their deception. He remarked quietly that the people hung on his every word. Only Matthias voiced a faint concern, a doubt about the path they were on, but it was quickly dismissed by Silas's unwavering logic. The foundation was laid not in faith, but in a carefully calculated deceit. The first deep snows arrived just as the settlement suffered its first loss. An elder, a man who had helped build the first cabins, succumbed to a fever that had gripped him for a week. His passing cast a solemn mood over the small community, a mood that was only deepened by the stark white landscape that greeted mourners on the day of the funeral. A bitter wind swept across the hilltop cemetery, pulling at the dark cloaks of the assembled settlers. Their breath clouded in the frigid air. The grave was a raw, dark scar against the perfect snow. Caleb Croft stood apart at the head of the grave, his presence a pillar of somber authority, his voice a low and resonant baritone cut through the wind. He spoke not of the pain of loss, but of a life well lived. He painted a picture of steadfast labor and quiet devotion, a narrative that seemed to soothe the grieving family. The elder's daughter, her face etched with sorrow, listened intently, her posture gradually straightening as Caleb promised her father's eternal peace. Among the mourners, Matthias Croft watched this performance with a growing sense of unease. He saw the genuine comfort his brother provided, and the contradiction tightened like a knot in his stomach. He kept his head bowed, his hands clenched tight within the sleeves of his coat, feeling a chill that had little to do with the weather. Silas stood beside him, a picture of statuesque calm. His gaze, however, was not on Caleb. He discreetly studied the faces of the settlers, assessing the depth of their grief and, more importantly, their trust. He noted the respectful nods, the quiet acceptance. Their deception was taking root, and he was satisfied. The ceremony proceeded with a slow, deliberate gravity. The three brothers stepped forward to lower the simple pine coffin into the frozen earth. Their movements were a synchronized dance of reverence. Each shovelful of dirt they cast upon the lid landed with a heavy, final thud. To the family, it was the sound of a chapter closing. As the last of the settlers trudged back down the hill toward the warmth of their cabins, the atmosphere on the hilltop shifted instantly. The performative sorrow fell away, replaced by a grim and focused silence. Silas scanned the empty cemetery before giving a single, sharp nod. They carried the coffin into the small, drafty preparation shed. The air inside was frigid, thick with the scent of sawdust and dried herbs. A single lantern hissed, casting long, distorted shadows on the log walls. Silas set the coffin on a wide trestle table with a quiet, definitive thud. Without a word, Silas began. His movements were economical and precise. He directed his brothers to lift the linen-shrouded form from its container. Matthias's hands, so steady when crafting wood, trembled as he grasped the cold, stiff burden. The weight felt like a condemnation. Silas had prepared for this moment. burlap sacks filled with clean river sand, and a basket of heavy, smooth stones waited in the corner. The process was methodical. They emptied the shroud of its true contents and carefully filled the linen shape with the bags and stones. Silas tested the weight repeatedly, ensuring the substitution would arouse no suspicion. Matthias's task was to sew the shroud shut again. His needle, usually an extension of his skill, felt clumsy and foreign. He pricked his finger, a bright spot of red staining the pale linen. His stitches were uneven, a stark contrast to his fine woodwork. Each pull of the thread felt like another lie being cinched into place. They placed the weighted shroud back into the coffin, arranging the folds to appear undisturbed. Silas leaned in close, his sharp eyes missing no detail. He adjusted a fold near the head with an impersonal touch. He pronounced their work acceptable with a quiet grunt. The elder was gone, replaced by a clever forgery of earth and stone. Later, in the relative warmth of their cabin, the three brothers sat around the hearth. Silas poured 3 glasses of amber whiskey. He raised his own in a silent, grim toast. Caleb readily lifted his glass. His face relaxed. He remarked that their difficult actions served a vital purpose for medical science in the eastern cities. Matthias left his glass untouched on the table. The fire's warmth could not reach the cold that had settled deep within him. He stared into the flames, seeing instead the preserved form now hidden in the cellar below. His own carefully prepared stew sat before him, congealing and forgotten. Silas stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the scattered lights below. His reflection was a pale ghost on the black glass. He observed that the settlement was small and its people were hardy. Deaths from natural causes would be too infrequent. The demand from their contacts was insatiable. Their current methods, he stated with calm finality, would soon prove inadequate. A fresh dread coiled in Matthias's stomach. Silas had reduced their violation to a matter of supply and demand. Ambition, once an abstract path to security, had now been given sharp teeth. Matthias looked from Silas's determined profile to Caleb's placid face and understood. The hollow coffin they had buried that day was only the beginning. The ground beneath his feet and his own soul felt increasingly unstable. Bitter wind swept through the settlement, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and the damp chill of coming rain. The sky was a low, oppressive blanket of gray. Samuel Brewer, the innkeeper, paused while stacking firewood to watch a solitary rider approach. The man's horse was spent, its coat lathered from a hard ride. The rider himself was draped in a cloak thick with the dust of a long journey. He dismounted with a stiff, weary motion and approached Samuel. His voice was low and purposeful as he asked for Silas Croft. Samuel, who knew the comings and goings of every soul in the clearing, found the request peculiar. Messengers were a rarity, and their business almost never concerned the quiet, respectable brothers. He gestured toward the property at the forest's edge, mentioning the unusual nature of the visit. The messenger offered a terse nod and led his exhausted animal away. He found Silas outside the workshop, assessing a length of timber. The stranger's approach was nearly silent, his presence announced only by the crunch of gravel under his boots. Silas turned, his sharp eyes registering no surprise, only a cool, analytical gaze. The messenger produced a letter sealed with a blot of dark wax. He pressed it into Silas's hand without ceremony. His instructions were simple, delivered with quiet intensity. He was to wait for no reply. The man then turned, remounted his horse, and rode back the way he had come without a single backward glance. Silas was left alone as dusk began to settle. The unopened letter felt unnaturally heavy in his hand. The wind plucked at its edges. The ordinary evening sounds of the settlement seemed to recede, leaving only the whisper of the cold and the weight of the message he held. He walked slowly back toward the cabin, his mind already working. The careful equilibrium of their lives was on the verge of shattering. Inside his study, Silas closed the heavy door. The latch clicked shut with a sound of finality. The room was a haven of order, smelling of old paper and lamp oil. A single lantern cast a warm, focused glow across his broad desk, illuminating his silver-nibbed pen and a pot of ink. He broke the wax seal on the letter. The script was formal and precise, the language of business. It was from their medical intermediary, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. The letter praised the exceptional quality of their previous shipments, noting the superb state of preservation. Then it presented the offer, a long-term, exclusive contract. The proposed fees were staggering, promising a level of financial security that seemed almost mythical. A cold, sharp thrill coursed through Silas. This was the validation he had craved. He reached for his ledger, a thick volume bound in dark leather. He opened it to a fresh page and began to calculate. The numbers flowed from his pen in a steady column. The profit margin was immense, truly transformative. But as he continued, a grim discrepancy emerged. He compared the new, demanding schedule against the settlement's predictable death rate. The figures refused to align. The shortfall was significant, an arithmetic truth that could not be reasoned away. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning softly. The opportunity was crystal clear, but the path to claiming it was now equally undeniable. Their passive method of waiting for nature to provide would fail. The silence in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with the inevitable conclusions solidifying in his mind. That evening, he summoned his brothers to the workshop. The space was chill and carried the faint, metallic scent of their recent work. Matthias entered last, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. Caleb arrived with a confident stride, his curiosity clearly piqued. Silas stood beside the open ledger. He laid out the letter's contents without any pleasantries, his voice a low, steady monotone. He painted a vivid picture of the wealth and security that awaited them, a legacy far beyond mere survival. Caleb's reaction was immediate. A wide, eager grin split his face. He began to pace the confined space, his mind racing. He saw his role as a traveling minister, not as a spiritual duty, but as the perfect cover for scouting. The very isolation of the frontier settlements, once a burden, was now a strategic advantage. Matthias felt the ground seem to shift under his feet. He stared at the ledger's columns, the neat figures seeming to blur and swim. His voice was a tight, strained whisper as he voiced his objections. He spoke of the immense danger, of the audacity of such a plan. They had already trespassed too far, he argued. To go further was to invite a damnation far more profound than any they had risked before. Silas listened, his expression unreadable. When Matthias fell silent, breathing heavily, Silas tapped a single pale finger on the ledger page. He stated the cold, simple arithmetic of their new reality. The demand was real. Their current supply was a mere trickle. To fulfill their contract, they would have to generate the supply themselves. The finality in his tone was absolute. The discussion was over. Caleb nodded, his eyes alight with a fervor that mixed greed and a strange sense of purpose. Matthias simply stood, his face drained of color, understanding that the last remnant of his former life had just been extinguished. The three brothers now looked out at the world through a new, predatory lens. Every solitary traveler, every isolated soul on the fringes of their community was suddenly recategorized. They were no longer neighbors or potential friends. They were inventory. A cold dawn painted the yard in shades of gray. Caleb Croft moved through the frost-covered grass, his breath making soft clouds in the air. He packed his saddlebags with practiced efficiency, arranging his journey's necessities. His religious texts, carefully wrapped, sat beside practical supplies of food. Every item had its specific place, a routine he followed before each departure. Silas waited inside the cabin, a single sheet of paper flat on the table before him. Caleb entered, bringing the chill of the morning with him. Silas did not look up, his attention fixed on the dense script. The list was more than travel notes. It was a ledger of opportunity, detailing remote places and the solitary individuals who moved between them. Caleb leaned in, his eyes calmly assessing the information. Silas pointed to a specific entry. "The trader with the raw silver is the priority," he murmured, his voice low. Caleb nodded, his expression one of serene understanding, and turned to leave. Outside, Caleb mounted his horse with an easy grace. A few early risers were beginning their day. He offered them a warm smile and a raised hand in a gesture of blessing. "Safe travels to you all," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. Then he turned his horse and nudged it forward. The path led away from the settlement into the misty woods where the familiar sounds faded, replaced by the silent purpose of his new mission. By midday, Silas found Samuel Brewer in the common room of the settlement's inn. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of wood smoke. The innkeeper greeted him with a friendly smile. Silas approached under the simple pretext of settling an account for wood. His tone was easy, that of a neighbor making casual conversation. He skillfully guided their talk toward the travelers who passed through the area, a topic Samuel was always eager to discuss. The innkeeper happily mentioned a solitary prospector who had camped up the valley just a week prior. He described the man's quiet nature and his worn-looking gear. Silas listened with polite interest while his mind coldly catalogued the details. The man's profound isolation made him ideal. He thanked the innkeeper with a show of genuine gratitude. To Samuel, it was a simple chat. To Silas, it was intelligence gathering, transforming a vague possibility into a concrete target. Back in the workshop, the air was thick with the smell of pine resin and chemicals. Matthias worked alone, his movements jerky and unsteady. He scrubbed at the stained wooden table with a rough brush, the scraping rhythm doing nothing to calm the tremor in his hands. A heavy metal tool slipped from his grasp. It hit the floor with a loud clang that echoed in the small space. Matthias flinched violently, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes were drawn unwillingly to the large preservation tank in the center of the room. It stood empty, its glass sides reflecting the lamplight. The emptiness felt like a promise of the horror to come. He knew exactly what would soon fill that space. This knowledge was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. Every creak of the old building, every sigh of the wind felt like an accusation. He was the artisan, the one whose skilled hands would perform the final grisly deception. The stability of their entire operation now rested on his increasingly fragile composure. The trail led Caleb deeper into a hushed forest of ancient trees. He found the camp exactly as described, a small canvas tent and a cold fire pit in a secluded clearing. A lone prospector looked up from his work, his face etched with the lines of a hard life lived alone. Caleb offered his most disarming smile and a greeting, presenting himself as a traveling minister. He spoke of offering companionship and a hot meal. The man's eyes, weary from solitude, lit up with a gratitude that was both profound and pitifully easy to secure. As dusk settled, Caleb built up the fire and shared his provisions. He guided their conversation with gentle, inexorable skill. He learned the man's name was Elias, that he had come west chasing a rumor of silver, and that he expected no letters from anyone. Over a simple meal, Caleb confirmed the most crucial details: no family, no fixed plans, no ties to any community. Night wrapped the camp in a cold, starry silence. The prospector's trust was now absolute. Caleb watched him, no longer seeing a fellow human, but an entry in a ledger, a solution to a problem of supply. The warmth of the shared fire was a lie, a tool for a chilling purpose. He murmured a quiet prayer, the words hollow in the vast darkness. The selection was final. The hunt was over. The sky was a flat, unbroken gray over the settlement, a heavy lid sealing the world below. A cold wind moved through the bare oaks surrounding the cemetery, carrying the scent of turned earth. Eleanor Vance stood slightly apart from the other mourners, her black dress a stark contrast to the muted landscape. Her grief was a quiet, internal pressure. The three Croft brothers moved around the open grave with a solemn, practiced coordination. Silas directed the proceedings with subtle, authoritative gestures. Matthias adjusted the ropes, lowering the pine coffin, his hands unusually fidgety. Caleb stepped forward, his voice a resonant comfort that washed over the gathered crowd. He spoke of Samuel Vance as a good man and a loving husband, his words a perfect blend of scripture and shared memory. The mourners were visibly soothed by his performance. Eleanor observed it all with a sharp, analytical eye. She noted the seamless choreography of the brothers, a well-rehearsed final act. A faint frown touched her lips as she watched Matthias. His nervous energy was a stark, discordant note against Caleb's composed delivery. When the coffin settled into the earth with a soft thud, the sound felt strangely insignificant to her. As the first shovels of dirt hit the wood, the ceremony felt less like a conclusion and more like a concealment. Days later, the weak afternoon light barely penetrated the workshop shed. Matthias knelt beside a half-finished coffin, his hands unsteady as he traced the smooth joinery. The air was thick with the smell of fresh pine and a faint, acidic tang. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the gray outside. She mentioned she had hoped to find him there, wanting to thank him again for his care with her husband's final arrangements. Matthias flinched at her words, his gaze dropping to the floor. He muttered that it was simply his duty, that every man deserved a proper send-off. Eleanor repeated the phrase quietly as she stepped closer. Her eyes drifted over the coffin on the sawhorses. She observed, her tone conversational, that her Samuel had been a large man. She found it strange, she added, that the coffin had felt surprisingly light when his brothers carried it. Matthias's head jerked up, his face a fleeting mask of pure shock. He quickly forced a tense smile. He stammered an explanation about the quality of the seasoned pine, how it was strong yet deceptively light. His words faltered and died in the dusty air. He wiped his sweaty hands on his apron, leaving dark smudges on the rough fabric. Eleanor watched him, her intelligent eyes absorbing every twitch and tremor. She had known Matthias for years as a steady, reliable man. This panicked stammering was entirely new. The puzzling lightness of the coffin was no longer just an oddity. It was a clue, and his reaction was a confirmation. She did not challenge him. She simply nodded, as if accepting his technical explanation. She commented that he was the expert after all. But internally, her mind was assembling pieces. The flawlessly smooth funeral, the brothers' practiced synchronicity, it all began to look like a carefully staged play. She felt she was the only one who had spotted a mistake. Matthias could not bring himself to look at her. A visible tremor ran through his hands as he picked up a strip of sanding leather, only to fumble and drop it. The steady craftsman was visibly coming undone. Eleanor made a final, polite remark about the chilly weather. He gave a jerky, distracted nod, his focus locked on the wood shavings at his feet. She announced she should be getting back to her house, her voice giving no hint of the steely determination crystallizing within her. She left him there, a man crumbling in the dim solitude of his workshop. Stepping outside, Eleanor felt a fundamental shift. The world was the same, but her role in it had changed. The raw pain of her grief cooled and hardened into something else entirely. She was no longer just a widow. She had become an investigator, and she would unearth the truth, whatever it cost and whoever it implicated. The faint wood smoke scent from her own chimney now carried the sharp, clean odor of resolve. The room Samuel Brewer rented her was a simple box with a bed and a table, perpetually chilled by the draft that seeped through the single window pane. That window offered a clear view of the settlement's main street, a ribbon of churned mud and slush that froze and thawed with the passing weeks. Eleanor paid for a full week, explaining she needed solitude to mourn. The innkeeper saw only a widow's grief, not the sharp focus of an investigator. She arranged her few belongings with quiet purpose, saving the leather journal for last. Its blank pages were a map waiting for a terrible truth. Her sorrow had hardened into a cold, determined engine. She began with dates, meticulously listing every burial the Croft brothers had conducted in the past year. The scratch of her pen was a steady sound against the muffled noise from the street. Each name she recorded felt like an accusation whispered in the quiet room. She spent long afternoons in the common room, a quiet figure by the hearth, nursing a single mug of weak ale. Her questions were veiled as casual concern. She asked settlers about travelers who had supposedly moved on, her tone laced with the widow's sympathy for those far from home. She collected fragments of conversations, small memories that seemed unimportant alone. A merchant known for his booming laugh was said to have departed in a hurry, yet a farmer's wife swore she heard that distinct laugh echo from the trading post days after his supposed burial. Another man, known for his fine leather gloves, was buried, but those same gloves were seen on a different settler's hands before the ground had even settled. These inconsistencies were like dropped stitches in a large tapestry. To Eleanor's eye, the entire pattern was starting to fray. Her journal filled with a web of connections, timelines cross-referenced and witness statements juxtaposed, all pointing in one dreadful direction. The settlement, once a place of shared hardship, now felt like a stage where the players rehearsed a lie. Everyone was an unwitting actor in a play whose final act remained a secret known only to the directors. She found the young man who cared for the stables amid the comforting smells of hay and horse. He was diligent, his hands gentle with the animals. Eleanor approached him one gray afternoon with a crafted story about a merchant her husband had known. She described the man in detail, focusing on his distinctive bay mare with a white diamond blaze. The stable hand's face lit up with recognition. He remembered the horse well, a fine animal. Then, wiping his hands on his trousers, he offered the crucial detail. He was certain he had seen that very mare, healthy and well-fed, in the Croft brothers' private stable over a week after the merchant was said to have moved on. He had thought nothing of it at the time, just a routine boarding job for the respected undertakers. For Eleanor, the world shifted on its axis. This was not a vague suspicion or a conflicting story. It was a solid, unassailable fact. The ground of her reality, already cracked, finally gave way completely, plunging her into a cold certainty. Back in her room, as twilight faded to a starless night, she spread her evidence across the rough table. The papers formed a constellation of gilt under the guttering candlelight. The stable hand's testimony was the brightest star, supported by many smaller points of light. There were conflicting travel plans, belongings left behind, and horses appearing where they should not be. She remembered Samuel's coffin, that fleeting sensation of unnatural lightness she had blamed on her grief. She understood now it was no trick of a distraught mind. It was the central truth of a monstrous scheme. The brothers were not just tending to the dead, they were creating them, harvesting the possessions and the very identities of those who passed through. Profound cold settled in her bones, sharper than the winter air outside. This knowledge was no longer her private burden. It was a poison that would infect the whole community. Yet it was a truth that demanded to be seen. There was a terrifying clarity in her resolve. The time for quiet investigation had ended. The next morning, she dressed with deliberate care, choosing her darkest, most formal dress. She gathered her journal and the most damning pages of notes, the stable hand's account copied out in her clearest hand, and tied the bundle securely with a piece of twine. Her hand did not shake as she closed the door behind her. She walked through the mud and slush with a measured pace, her boots making a steady rhythm. Her destination was the small office of Magistrate Josiah Ward, a man known for his deep desire to maintain order and the settlement's fragile peace. She knew he prized stability above all, and her accusations would be a stone thrown into a placid pond. But the private vigil was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The magistrate's study felt unnaturally quiet. Only the soft hiss of dying embers broke the silence. Josiah Ward sat behind his great oak desk, a man accustomed to the weight of authority. Eleanor Vance stood before him, a figure of stark contrast in her dark mourning clothes. She placed a small, neat stack of papers on the polished wood between them. Her voice was steady and clear as she began. She presented her findings not as a plea, but as a report. She spoke of mismatched dates and witness accounts. She mentioned the innkeeper Samuel Brewer's observations. Then she delivered the stable hand's key testimony about the merchant's distinctive bay horse. Ward listened, his expression growing more grave with each fact. The familiar ground of his jurisdiction felt suddenly unstable. He tried to gentle his tone, suggesting grief could sometimes cast long shadows. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. She met his caution with cold logic, forcing him to confront each inconsistency. The real tension was not in any argument, but in the quiet pressure of truth against his deep desire for peace. Accusing the Croft brothers meant shattering the settlement's fragile harmony. This was a responsibility he had carried for decades. He looked from her resolute face to the precise handwriting on the pages. Her investigation felt like a meticulously laid trap around his own reluctance. He argued for the brothers' long service, for the trust built over 37 years. To act on suspicion felt like a betrayal of the community itself. The stability he had nurtured was his primary concern. The study, once his refuge, now felt like a cage. Eleanor had expected this. With a quiet, deliberate movement, she opened a small leather satchel. She explained she had not relied solely on local accounts. Discreet inquiries had been sent to neighboring settlements. She laid 3 separate letters on his desk. The papers were coarse, the handwriting and inks distinct from one another. Their message, however, was unified and chilling. They confirmed that several men documented as buried in the local cemetery had never reached their destinations. One letter specifically mentioned the trader Corbin and his unique horse. Magistrate Ward himself had seen that very animal at the Croft property weeks after Corbin's supposed burial. Ward picked up one of the letters. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in his hand. His fingers, which usually handled documents with firm authority, trembled slightly. The words were incontrovertible. They demolished the last walls of his disbelief. The full weight of his office settled upon him with a grim and undeniable force. He looked at Eleanor and saw not a vindictive widow, but an agent of a terrifying justice. His final resistance evaporated. His voice was low, burdened by the decision he could no longer avoid. A quiet inquiry. Nothing more for now. He authorized a discreet examination of the most recent graves. He instructed her to gather a small, trusted party. The conflict was now official, a crack in the settlement's foundation that could not be sealed. Across the settlement, the brothers felt the shift in the air. Their workshop, usually a place of methodical industry, hummed with a frantic, fearful energy. Silas stood before his workbench, his tall frame a pillar of unnerving calm. His hands moved with their usual precision, inventorying tools, but his mind was entirely focused on the threat. Caleb paced the worn floorboards like a caged animal. His anger was a roaring fire, fueled by a sense of profound injustice. He muttered about the community's ingratitude, his voice a low thunder that barely masked the cold fear beneath. Matthias sat slumped on a stool in the corner, his face a mask of pallid dread. The skilled hands that could carve delicate filigree now trembled uselessly in his lap. The reality of their exposure was a physical weight crushing his spirit. He saw only the specter of public shame and the punishment to come. Silas turned from the bench, his sharp eyes cutting through the heated atmosphere. He acknowledged the threat Eleanor Vance represented with a clinical nod. He stated that flight was their only path. But he insisted they could not simply run. They needed one final, decisive act. He proposed a plan to ensure the truth was buried with the evidence. A grim silence fell as his brothers absorbed his words. The unified front they had maintained for nearly 4 decades fractured under the pressure. Caleb's bluster faded into a sullen, desperate acceptance. Matthias could only manage a feeble nod, his will utterly broken. Their life in the settlement was over. All that remained was the grim work of covering their tracks one last time. The cold of the night seemed to seep into the very walls of their workshop. The first gray light of dawn found a somber assembly in the settlement cemetery. A low mist clung to the headstones, and the air held a damp chill. Magistrate Josiah Ward stood with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, the gravity of the morning evident in his stiff posture. A small, hand-picked crew of men stood nearby, their shovels feeling like instruments of sacrilege in the quiet, sacred space. Silas Croft positioned himself before the magistrate, his tall frame a study in wounded pride. He spoke with a voice laden with sorrow, his words carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. He protested the violation of the hallowed ground his family had tended for so long. His performance was masterful, swaying the muttered sympathies of many onlookers who had known the brothers for years. Eleanor Vance observed from the periphery, her face a calm mask that hid the turmoil within. Matthias Croft stood apart, visibly trembling. He seemed unable to look toward the fresh grave, his usual sturdy presence entirely collapsed into palpable dread. The sight of him unsettled those who noticed. Magistrate Ward listened to Silas's eloquent appeal, his own expression conflicted. Finally, he raised a hand for silence. His voice was low but carried undeniable authority. "We must have the truth," he stated, and gave the order to begin. The first shovels bit into the earth with a dull, wet sound. The work was slow and grim. Once the grave was open, the men lowered ropes into the pit. A murmur of confusion rippled through the settlers as the coffin was hoisted. It rose with surprising ease, the ropes slack, the weight all wrong for a man's final resting place. Silas stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Matthias had wrapped his arms around himself as if cold. Caleb's eyes darted nervously across the hostile faces encircling them. At the magistrate's grim nod, a workman wedged a pry bar under the coffin lid. The splintering crack echoed in the tense silence. He levered the lid upwards. Inside, arranged with cruel precision, was a form shaped from river stones and coarse sand. There was no body. The meticulous deception laid bare a years-long betrayal. A collective gasp swept the crowd, a wave of horror that instantly curdled into anger. Trust shattered in that silent moment. Eleanor's expression showed no surprise, only a grim and somber vindication. Magistrate Ward's face turned ashen. He pointed a trembling finger at the brothers, his voice thick with revulsion. He ordered them confined to their home under immediate guard. The crowd's shock boiled over into shouted accusations as the brothers were led away, their disgrace complete. Later that evening, a fragile calm settled over the brothers' house, enforced by two of the magistrate's men. Silas sat motionless in a high-backed chair near the hearth, his face an unreadable mask of patience. Matthias paced the room's perimeter like a trapped creature, his hands twisting together. The weight of their exposure was a physical presence in the quiet room. Then an orange glow flared outside the window. Shouts erupted, followed by the clear, panicked cry of "Fire!" The two guards exchanged a single horrified glance before rushing out the door toward the commotion. The settlement erupted into chaos. Silhouettes of neighbors frantically passing buckets from the river toward the roaring flames that engulfed the brothers' workshop. In the sudden stillness of the house, Silas rose. He uttered a low, urgent command to his brother. Matthias, galvanized by terror, moved with him. They confronted the lone guard, who had remained at the front door. A brief, brutal struggle ensued in the dark hallway. Leaving the man unconscious on the floor, they slipped out the back and vanished into the deep, welcoming darkness of the woods. By dawn, the fire was defeated, leaving only a skeleton of charred beams and smoldering embers where the workshop once stood. As the exhausted settlers surveyed the damage, Magistrate Ward and a few investigators picked through the ruin. Behind a collapsed wall, they noticed a section of the stone floor that was unnaturally clean and undamaged. One man levered up a heavy flagstone with a crowbar, revealing a set of rough steps descending into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and carried a strange, cloying scent of herbs and chemicals. Lantern light illuminated a hidden cellar untouched by the fire. It was a chamber of clinical horror. Sturdy tables held arrays of polished steel tools. Against the far wall stood several large, barrel-like tanks. One investigator peered into a cloudy solution and recoiled. his voice dropping to a strained whisper as he reported seeing pale, preserved forms within. The brothers were gone, but their gruesome legacy remained, a silent testament to the horrors they had concealed. The cold morning light fell across Silas Croft's study with a harsh and revealing glare. Every surface was immaculate, a testament to a mind that demanded absolute order. Magistrate Josiah Ward moved through the room with a heavy heart, his men conducting their search in a tense silence that felt louder than any outburst. A young investigator's careful examination paid off. His fingers detected a subtle irregularity in the wall paneling near the great oak desk. A firm press on a specific spot yielded a soft, mechanical click. A hidden section of the wall swung inward without a sound, revealing a deep, dark cavity. Inside, the cavity rested a heavy iron-bound chest. It took the combined strength of two men to lift the formidable object onto the desktop. The lock was ancient and sturdy, but it gave way under the force of a pry bar with a sharp, cracking report. Magistrate Ward himself lifted the lid, revealing a stack of ledgers bound in faded leather. He opened the first volume. Silas's handwriting was unnervingly precise, each letter formed with deliberate care. The entries were not written in the language of emotion or regret, they were cold, factual records. They spoke of acquisitions and preservation quality, of specimens and transport logistics. A man standing behind the magistrate muttered quietly that it looked like a merchant's inventory. Page after page turned, each line a stark conversion of a human life into a mere entry. The numbers accumulated with a dreadful consistency. The quiet in the room thickened into something palpable and grim. This was no simple chronicle of grave robbery. It was a systematic accounting of murder, documented with the detached efficiency of a factory foreman. The terrible secret of the hollow ground was here, laid out in ink and paper. The settlement's foundation was not just built on lies, but on a calculated, industrial-scale horror. The full scope of the corruption was now irrefutably quantified. Magistrate Ward felt a deep, cold sickness settle within him. He reached for the final ledger in the chest, its cover marked with the number 17. Pages were different. They contained no simple lists. This was Silas Croft's personal testament, a chilling philosophical justification for the atrocities. Silas argued with cold logic that their work served a greater good. He framed the procurement of anatomical specimens as a vital, if unacknowledged, service to medical science. He portrayed himself and his brothers as martyrs to progress, sacrificing the few for the benefit of the many. The clinical rationality of the text was more frightening than any passionate confession could have been. The words revealed a man who saw his crimes as a necessary business, a grim duty. The magistrate understood then that Silas felt no guilt, only a profound resentment that his vital work had been interrupted. The ledger's final pages contained coded references to an escape route, plans to re-establish their operation in a new territory far to the west. The brothers had not been undone by justice, but by a simple, unlucky accident. They were already gone, their trade likely continuing elsewhere under a new name. The sun beat down on the same river valley a century later, heating the dry clay earth. A workman, his overalls coated in dust, paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He was digging a foundation trench for a new county road, a project meant to bring modernity to this long-forgotten place. His shovel struck something solid with a dull clang of metal on metal. He cleared away the dirt with his hands, revealing a rusted box, its lock fused shut by decades of corrosion. Curiosity got the better of him. He used the edge of his spade, to wrench the lid open, the sound sharp and grating in the quiet air. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth that had mostly held, was a book. The leather cover was stiff but intact. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with that same neat-sloping script he could not read. He initially thought it an old farm account book. Then his eyes picked out recognizable words, dates, descriptions, sums of money listed in tight columns. One entry detailed a payment for a large male subject acquired through what was termed a nocturnal harvest. Another mentioned a female, young, whose condition was compromised by fever. His casual interest quickly soured into a feeling of deep unease. He couldn't grasp the full historical context, but the macabre nature of the business was unmistakable. He called his foreman over, extending the book with a grimy hand. He said the foreman ought to take a look, that it was a peculiar thing he'd found. The foreman, a practical man with little patience for history, skimmed a few pages. His expression tightened with distaste. He handed the ledger back as if it carried a contagion. He dismissed it as some strange old business. He told the workman to just toss it back in the hole. They had a schedule to keep and a road to build. The metal box was kicked aside, left to be buried once more under tons of gravel and poured concrete. All around the trench, the land was silent. Young trees grew through the crumbled foundations of cabins that were no more. Wildflowers covered the remnants of old stone walls. The settlement had vanished, its very name erased from maps and memory. The physical evidence of the hollow ground was interred again. Yet a faint, unsettling echo of the old crime persisted, a subtle stain on the quiet air that the new road would never fully erase. The ground remembered what humanity had willingly forgotten.